This is Alyssa Essman, Assistant Professor in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science at Ohio State, and I'm also the State Extension Specialist for Weed Science. And today I'll be presenting kind of those top 5 considerations for weed management for 2025. In 2024, water hemp was the #1 most common weed in our pre-harvest soybean survey. This is Ohio Soybean Council funded work where we essentially drive around the state and we evaluate fields just prior to harvest for the frequency and distribution of 10 different weed species. In the past 5 or so years, we've really seen an increase in the prevalence of water hemp across the state, which essentially led it to come in as #1 in terms of being the most commonly encountered weed on this pre-harvest survey in 2024. Like I said, was the most common weed in 24 in the survey. You can see here a map of what this distribution across the state looks like. The areas we survey are really those more in the western portion of the state where a lot of soybean production happens. And you can see, based on this legend, the darker a county, the greater prevalence of water hemp within that county. For those counties that are white, that doesn't mean water hemp is not within that county. We just didn't randomly encounter it on our survey. And so this is really one of those top considerations to keep in mind for weed management, thinking into the future and especially for 2025. And so there are a couple of things that come up and reasons why water hemp has become so problematic. Primarily among these are the biological characteristics of water hemp. It has really high seed production, somewhere in the range of 500,000 to 1 million seeds per plant. It has a really fast growth rate, up to an inch and a half a day. It has a really long emergence window. So relative to another common weed in Ohio, giant ragweed, that comes up pretty early in the season, but tends to drop off in the summer. Water hemp emerges later, but will continue to emerge up to and through late summer and early fall. It is also really a high genetic diversity plant. So it is dioecious, meaning the male and female plants are separate, and it has to outcross to reproduce, right? And so that's double the genetic pool that leads to this offspring. And that's part of the reason why we see really rapid herbicide resistance development in water hemp, right? So aside from these biological characteristics, it does also have a very diverse herbicide resistance profile. And so for the management of water hemp in response to these biological characteristics and also this increasing prevalence of herbicide resistance, so there's really some management considerations we can keep in mind for this weed in particular. The first of which is identification, right? Brushing up on what makes water hemp different than some of those species that look very similar, things like red root pigweed. Using a diverse weed management program, right, which includes both comprehensive herbicide programs and also cultural control tactics. For this weed in particular, we want to focus on late season scouting because of these issues we've talked about, specifically this really high seed production and herbicide resistance. It's not something we want to leave in the field at the end of the season. And so late season scouting, identification, and actually hand removal of those plants is really the best strategy to get ahead of managing it for the following growing season. So this brings us to our second consideration, which is of course herbicide resistance in our weed populations. We know this is an issue for water hemp, as we've talked about. We also see it for some of our other common weed species, right? Like giant ragweed, and mare's tail, and also some concerns about this issue in annual or Italian ryegrass species, which is one of those that we're hearing more about across the state in recent years. Herbicide resistance in weed populations really is one of the greatest threats to crop production, right? We know several Ohio populations, especially of water hemp and other common and troublesome weeds, do have decreased sensitivity to many of our effective herbicide options, right? And so for this, we really want to prioritize diversity in our weed management approach. So this includes comprehensive herbicide programs, including more than one effective site of action in order to decrease that selection pressure on our remaining effective options. Appropriate product selection for the weed spectrum in a given field, which may not be the same program across an entire operation. Utilizing full labeled herbicide rates to reduce that chance for escapes late season and also the potential for resistance development, right? So following labeled application parameters as well to reduce risk of things like antagonism and other issues. And again, considering cultural control strategies, things like cover crops, in order to reduce the size and the density of weeds at the time of our herbicide applications. Our third consideration then is related to herbicide label compliance, right? And the goal here really is to preserve our herbicide options for the long term. So a couple things that came up last year, growers across the state received letters from chemical companies reminding them about technology use agreements for traded soybeans and associated herbicide products. Right, so as always, compliance and following the herbicide label is really critical for continued use of our herbicide and any new weed management technology that might come to market. Now, as much as ever, compliance with labels is really critical. Not only is it critical, it is the law for use of these products, right? And overall, our goal and message for this is to maintain both the efficacy of our products, but also the availability of these products for as long as possible. And compliance is a really important part of this effort, right? So this also includes following new label guidance related to the Endangered Species Act that we'll talk about here in a minute. But first, our fourth consideration is related to Dicamba. This is just a reminder that there is no registration for those 3 herbicide products that were labeled for over-the-top use in soybean, right? So in early 2024, registration was vacated for these products, being XtendiMax, Ingenia, and Tavium. An existing stocks order was put into place for last season, and the last date for application in Ohio was June 30th, 2024. What that means is, at present, there are no Dicamba products labeled for over-the-top use in dicamba-resistant soybean for the 2025 growing season. What this means for us this year is that other dicamba products that are used pre-plant do require adherence to the labeled plant back intervals, regardless of soybean trait system. And where dicamba-resistant soybeans are used, we need to consider other post options in those programs based on the trait packages of our seed. And then our fifth and final consideration for this growing season is the EPA and the Endangered Species Act Herbicide Strategy and what that means for the future of herbicide use, right? So the final herbicide strategy was released by the EPA in August 2024. This is essentially a framework set up to meet the obligations outlined in the Endangered Species Act with respect to mitigating off-target movement, right? So things like herbicide drift, runoff, and erosion. Herbicide labels are going to be subject to changes based on this framework as they work through the registration review process, right? And actually, the first product with a label that follows these guidelines was released last October, and this is the BASF product, Liberty Ultra. Following these guidelines, including really diligent record keeping, essentially ensures that growers are better protected with the necessary documentation in the event of off-target movement. And so for this herbicide strategy and new label guidelines, essentially compliance looks like reviewing the herbicide label, which we're always doing anyway, but also reviewing the EPA's Bulletins Live 2 system. So we have this website link here, and also an example of what that looks like, right? So it will show any pesticide use limitation areas for a specific product in question. So we can see here, as of February 2025, there were no pesticide use limitations for Liberty Ultra in Ohio. Any required mitigation strategies, either listed directly on the herbicide label that applies anywhere the herbicide will be applied, or on this Bulletin's Live 2 system, which is more location specific. Mitigation strategies required from those can be found on the EPA's mitigation menu, which is the link at the bottom here. For questions related to these or other topics related to weed management, feel free to reach out to me. I have listed my email here. We also have a website with the link here, or you can find us across essentially all social media sites at Ohio State Weeds.